Hey, I'm Caleb, part of the Narrate team. Thanks for listening to the Narrate podcast. This week, Adam talks about the tension between necessary endings, forgiveness, and reconciliation in part 3 of a series called Necessary Endings.
Hi, how's it going? That you're here either means you already killed your deer or you don't hunt. So I'm just going to assume that you already killed your deer. It's great to be with you. So we've been in this series the last couple of weeks, and just in case you weren't with us, or even if you were, I think I would like to just kind of get us up to this place because there's a little bit of context here. We've been in this series called Necessary Endings, hence the Wile E. Coyote kind of metaphor there. But we've been talking a lot about is dirt, because what we've observed is that dirt by its very nature is made up of organic endings, right? They're things that have died, things that used to be beautiful and used to be important and used to be successful and used to be valued, and they died. And that's kind of a sobering reminder for all of us in some sense. And yet, at the same time, dirt, what we've explored is that dirt isn't just a bunch of death, that dirt is also latent energy. And that new life is possible because old life ended. Whether we're talking about getting rid of unhealth, or we're talking about just creating space, or we're talking about channeling or focusing growth, that dirt is valuable for all of those things because there's an ending and there's a new beginning all in one. And so what really the design of this series was to provoke all of us as bosses and managers and leaders, as spouses, as boyfriends and girlfriends and friends and parents, to just begin to explore where is there the need for some pruning, where are there the need for some necessary endings, whether that's getting rid of disease, getting rid of baggage, or that's creating space. Any of those would apply. And so the hope is that you've just been exploring. It's kind of that drawer in your kitchen, same kind of vibe, like, okay, so what needs to go because the drawer won't close anymore? That's kind of what we've been doing here. So we started by just simply observing that if we're not careful, one of our emotional responses to change, which is what a necessary ending requires, is that we run from it, we fight it. And what we explored in the scriptures and what we've explored with the psychological sciences is that the important thing is to change our posture there, to see that change may be a great thing, and thus, before we assume they're all bad, that we treat them as opportunities and see if maybe good might come from it. In fact, one of the ways to think about this, and we did this in the first week, would just be to think, if you were to catalog the deepest pain you've ever experienced, the worst moments of your life, chances are it's an ending. And yet, in so many cases, if you were to catalog the moments in your life that you would never change, because you wouldn't have that job, or you wouldn't be in this relationship, or you wouldn't be living here, that it probably also came from a really deep, dark, hurtful ending. And so that's not to assume that all endings are good, but it does say, like, hey, maybe we need to change our posture. And then last week we turned a corner and started talking about relationships. And if you weren't with us, I would encourage you to grab that podcast, not because I think it was particularly eloquent, but because I think the question is so foundational. Because the question we explored last weekend is, do you approach life as though you can change people? And I think if we're going to ask the question about endings, whether we're talking about adult children, or we're talking about a spouse having an affair, or we're talking about an employee who's not performing up to standards, that one of the first things we have to understand is, how do we approach people? Do we approach them as though, if given enough time, I can change them? And if so, then we'll be able to predict your behaviors. And if not, we'll be able to predict your behaviors. So this week, before next week jumping into a different type of ending, I want to take one more swing at relationships, because I'm not particularly good at them, so it takes me a lot of time to get anything right when I talk about them. Maybe would be one way to say that. But actually, one of the things I'd like to confess is that I think, and maybe you've had this thought, I wish I could have a conversation with you personally, because I would ask the thought, as a boss, as a spouse, as a leader, is the idea, has it been presented in overly simplistic terms? Like, right, because it's kind of cause and effect. It's kind of 2 + 2 = 4. It's kind of A leads to B leads to C. It's kind of this like, well, yeah, dummy, like people make choices and there's consequence for it, so just live your life that way. And yet I think the reality is when you're looking at a real person, a real spouse, a real child, a real underperforming employee, a real unhealthy boss, the reality is when you're looking at a person, it's not as clean as that. It's a little more complicated than choices and consequences and, you reap what you sow, cause and effect. Do you find that? Again, I keep returning to a friend who says to me, and I'm reminded of this almost every week in at least one meeting, that theological issues don't walk into my office. People do. And it's really easy to talk in really simplistic, simple terms about things like divorce and sexuality and a host of other things when you're standing in front of a lecture hall. But when you're sitting across the table from a person dealing with it, completely different story. And I think if you could explore why you struggle to be a person, a leader, a parent, a spouse, why you struggle to step into the wisdom of necessary endings, I think if you could ask the question relationally, why do you struggle? I'll bet it comes back to the word forgiveness. Because I think, and maybe I'm just projecting because this is certainly my experience, I think we're deeply confused about what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And I think that sometimes we think that there's these two ideas of boundaries, of consequences, of necessary endings. I think we think that they are mutually that they are opposed to the idea of forgiveness and grace. That they are in opposition to one another. And this morning, I think we have to explore. Here's another way to think about it is, like, we've been saying 2D, right? Like, there's dirt, there's life, there's death, there's beginning, there's endings. But it's not that easy, is it? Because dirt consists of more than just organic materials that used to live. Anybody else know what's in dirt? Did you notice them crawling across the floor? This one's been trying to escape for a long time. There's these things called worms, right? And with all due respect to the Lord, I don't think forgiveness is a worm, but I do think that so far we've went like beginnings, endings, cause, effect, consequences, decisions. I go, no, there's this other thing called a worm that's kind of involved in the scenario. And we have to deal honestly, like, because it doesn't really fit the equation. How many of you have houseplants with worms in the soil? No, you don't. You don't want worms in your soil. Did you know that if all the topsoil from the planet was removed, the land masses the land would retain its shape purely because of the number of earthworms in the topsoil? Kind of weird, right? So I want to ask this question, forgiveness. Like, how does it fit in? You know, what's interesting to me is even if, and some of you probably fall into this camp, even if you don't approach life from what does Jesus say kind of standpoint, even if you're someone that's steeped in the sciences and psychology, you don't have to Google for very long before what you see is a lot of really powerful clinical research that supports the idea that having the ability to forgive, like the forgiveness muscle, is paramount if you're going to be a healthy person. Physically, psychologically, study after study, read of one study that demonstrated that people who have the ability to forgive have a lower blood pressure and a healthier heart rate. One study dealt with people recovering from open heart surgery and found that those who have the ability to forgive actually recovered more completely and more rapidly. People who can forgive are not only physically healthier, they have better relationships. Study after study, marriages, relationships with kids, that they're better employees. One study even suggested that people who have the ability to forgive are much more likely to be high achievers, that the majority of our high achievers in the world, our leaders, our entrepreneurs, they're forgiving people because they have the ability to have things not go their way and recover. And so forgiving people are more successful or more fruitful, as we would like to say around here. Forgiveness translates into marriage. It translates into our emotions. In fact, one psychiatrist just simply says it this way: evidence affirms, go ahead, next slide. Evidence affirms when you forgive others, you are the primary beneficiary. I don't know if you see it yet, but I think if we're not careful, if we just move on, all of that is in opposition to the forgiveness piece. And we have to somehow fit this together. And then if you're a Christ follower, and then if you're someone that's really trying to live the kingdom life, then if you really believe that Jesus can give you the kind of life that is free of worry and free of anxiety and free of resentment and hatred, then you begin to understand and you know you can't possibly follow Christ and not be a forgiving person. In fact, the text that we gave you to just reflect on during offering is maybe one of the best reminders that this is central to what Jesus teaches. In Matthew 6, so the context here is some disciples who were raised praying, recognize that Jesus prays differently, and they come to him and they say, hey, will you give us a framework? Like, we've been praying since we came out of the chute, but we really, when we watch you, we feel like we don't know what we're doing. So could you kind of give us a framework for how in the world to do this? And so Jesus, he says, yeah, here you go. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Now, many would say that what we have here is a pecking order, a punch list, when you approach God, here's the categories to think in, and here's the order in which you ought to process them. And so we start with affirming, like, God, you are bigger, more powerful. This is one of the things I hear Kate say all the time, that for her, what works really well when she's dealing with a problem is just to remind herself, even visually, how much smaller that problem is than God himself. And Jesus says, just spend your time affirming God and who he is and what he's about. And when you feel like you can move on from there, pray, your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. See, this is that reminder that we are prone to develop our own agenda and think that life is about us. And it's this reminder, tell God, tell yourself that life isn't about you and your priorities. It's about him and his inbreaking kingdom that you're a part of. And then pray, give us today our daily bread. Affirm you are dependent. Your ideas, your business, your relationships, your health, your finances, your ability to get through today emotionally, you are deeply dependent upon God to meet your needs. And then he says, and forgive us our debts. See, there's this invitation to have this muscle called forgiveness, the ability to forgive. And what he affirms from the very word go is remind yourself when you talk to God why you get to talk to God. Not because you've arrived, and not because you're perfect enough, and not because you're more good than you are bad, but you're broken. And it's because of who he is. See, here Jesus contrasts, what the scholars tell us is he's contrasting the lifestyle, the invitation of Judaism and Christianity from those that were prevalent in their day. Because most people then, as of now, and now, they lived in a cause and effect, black and white, formulaic thing. You do something, you get what you deserve, that's that. And while Jesus certainly affirms that our choices matter, he reminds us that our choices aren't greater than God's grace and than his forgiveness. He reminds us that in God, forgiveness is possible. In the cross, it becomes actual. And yet, if we're honest, it's kind of a sobering reminder, isn't it? That prayer isn't just about telling God who he is and telling him what your agenda is and what it isn't and asking him to give you a parking spot. That it's also about recognizing you're broken. And as sobering as that is, he then affirms, but hey, like it's available as often as you might need it. His forgiveness, my forgiveness, available as often. And yet, there's a catch, isn't there? And I say all that to simply say this. Here's, I think, where we start to believe that these two ideas are opposed to one another. Because we know, wait a minute, there's a catch. How do I fire this person? How do I say no to that friend because of a boundary? How do I allow the natural consequences in my... How do I do that while at the same time being a forgiving person? It's a quandary, isn't it? I had this play itself out for me because, right, there's this catch. Maybe I should read it before I go on, because Jesus, he doesn't just say, and forgive us our debt, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And we don't even understand why there's a catch. Sometimes we approach it like it's superstitious, but we kind of know, like, okay, I'm going to need forgiveness, and therefore I better forgive, and therefore I'm going to be a pushover as a leader and a boss and a parent and a friend. Anybody with me? Like, it's just this, like, what gives here? I had this play itself out last week, so a child of mine who shall remain anonymous is of that ilk, that his temperament is such that the phrase, if his head wasn't attached, he would lose it, applies directly to him. It is astounding to me how quickly he can drop something, break something, or lose something. So an ongoing saga in our life, because I'm a little bit type A, an ongoing saga in our life is he got this iPod a couple years ago from his grandma for Christmas. And since getting it, he lost his charger, the charger I gave him when I got the new iPhone, the charger my wife gave him when she got the new iPhone, and then I literally found a cord running on the street, gave him that, and he's managed to keep track of that, but he lost the box. So I've known all this while, like, you need to buy your own charger, because I bet you if you buy your own charger, you won't. That's the only hope I have, is maybe if he starts buying all of his own stuff, he won't waste it so much, because then he'll understand the cost of it. So I've been telling him, you need to buy your own charger. So last Saturday, We're getting ready to go to bed, getting ready for church the next morning. And when my wife's in the band, she's worked really hard to make that a positive memory for the kids. And so the way she's done that is they come with her. They get here at 6:30 or so. But the caveat is the blessing there for them is they get to play their device without distraction for 90 minutes, which is a big deal because otherwise, read 2 minutes, get to play one. So, it's just like, it is a free-for-all for them. So they love coming. They love it when she's in the band because they just get to sit there and play Minecraft forever. So he's getting ready to charge his iPod, and he can't find his charger. And I'm going, yes, I've been waiting for this. I'm not celebrating, but there's part of me that's like, yes, this is my chance to teach him this lesson. And he's because because Teresa had to charge her iPad, so she couldn't use that. He couldn't use that charger, and he's just stuck. Like finally, he's stuck in his decisions. And I'm grieving. I'm not crying with him, but I'd kind of like to because there's that whole cliche, like it hurts you more than it hurts me, and it applies when you're a parent. Some of you like that's terrible, but we're going through this thing. I'm like, sorry, dude. And like you need to buy a charger. I don't have any money. I know it's because you bought lollipops last week, but you can save some money, and someday you'll get to play your iPod again. And then just kind of rest assured, just as he went to bed, he found his cord. His brother let him borrow his box, and all was well in his world. Next day, Sunday afternoon, 2:00. I'm sitting in a friend's house watching football when my phone rings 3 times in a row. Now, I'm not a genius, but I am good at ignoring my phone. But 3 times in a row gives me a signal. So then I opened up Google Voice because I get those transcriptions of what the voicemail said because I don't like to answer the phone. I just like to read what the phone's telling me. And I pick up wallet lost, I have it. So I call this woman. And she says, I have your wallet. And I said, why? And she said, I found it in the middle of the street. I said, what street? Where? She said, right in the middle of the street, right in front of Memorial Park. I said, when? She said, just a little bit ago. I said, well, how do you know my number? Well, I've looked at your fishing license, and I bought some dresses. I said, but seriously, like, why do you have my wallet? I said, it was just sitting in the middle of the road. She said, well, no, it wasn't sitting in the middle of the road. It was in a coat pocket. It was a blue coat, and I pulled over, and I go, oh, yeah, I wore my blue coat to church this morning, and then it was in my pocket, and and I have this moment, like, I know, I've done this 1,000 times. So have you. I threw my coat on top of the car. I opened the hatchback, and now I'm freaking out, like, oh my gosh, I hope my backpack made it inside the car because my laptop's in there. So I ran out and said, it's there. Oh, good. But do you do this? And I throw the backpack in the back of the car, close the hatchback, coat's on the roof. I go to a friend's house to watch football and get reminded that I'm a hypocrite. And here we are, right? Like, here's why I can't be a father that gives people boundaries because I'm just reminded that here I go. As soon as I point out a flaw, as soon as I soon as I go, necessary ending, sorry, dude, this is going to hurt, I'm reminded I need grace. My prayer this morning, and it was unscripted, as I just found myself at my office this morning praying over the morning, and it was simply this: Lord, would you help us be people who have healthier relationships and who are better leaders? And I think this is what makes it hard. Because we don't know when is forgiving, and when is it functional, and when are we calling it forgiveness when in fact it's something else. And where I'm excited is not because of my intellect, because it's low, but in the midst of this struggle and the research that I did, I bumped into some research that helped me tremendously. And what it differentiated both psychologically and biblically is the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation and trust. And I think when you start to understand the way God talks about those being 3 separate things, you'll actually be freed up as a parent, as a spouse, as a leader, as a boss, as an employee, as a friend. So let's just talk, if we can, about forgiveness. Because we know forgiveness is about the past. And the thing about forgiveness is, and this is what makes it so darn tricky, because remember, Jesus even moves on from his prayer, and he says, if you don't forgive others, then I'm not going to forgive you. And so we're like, I'm scared. But the thing about forgiveness is forgiveness only requires one person. You can forgive somebody. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you're just to take forgiveness in its literal terms, you can forgive somebody without their participation because it's a past offense that you're choosing to not hold against them, that you're choosing to erase the debt. And sometimes you've probably even heard someone say, oh, so you forgive and you forget. This is the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard. I've believed it, but the more I've researched it and the more I tried to live it, it doesn't work. I even heard someone talk about how when God forgives us, he forgets what we've done. Like, just stop and think about how much sense that doesn't make. So you're telling me that you get to heaven and you go, hey, God, remember that David and Bathsheba thing? And he goes, no. What? What David and Bathsheba thing? It's in your book. Well, I forgot all about it. come to think of it, I don't know the Bible because it's all full of sin, so I've forgotten all of it. So what are you doing here? Like, in order to forgive something, there has to be a thing, right? The people who are dysfunctional as employees and friends and relationships, they're the ones who their parents wounded them deeply as a child. That's all of us who were parents. But the ones who are dysfunctional are the ones who don't acknowledge that, right? Because then they go and they get a boss, and then they get another boss, and they get another boss. And every boss they've ever had is the biggest jerk and the worst authority they've ever had. And they think it's the boss problem. And the reality is, it's a parent problem. They haven't forgiven a parent. I love the way Dr. Cloud says this. He says this, to forgive, go ahead, to forgive requires that you name the offense, feel the feelings involved, talk about the pain and anger, and then grieve it. It's not a forget thing. It's a deal with it thing. But scripturally, it only takes you. People will walk around and they'll say, we're all right with God. Why? Because of the cross, because we're all forgiven. We are all forgiven. That's what God did. He dealt with all of our sin. He grieved it. He named it. He felt it. But that's different than us being reconciled to God. See, reconciliation is another matter entirely. This is, I don't know, like for me, the lights went off and I went, I can't wait to share this with my friends. Reconciliation, it was pointed out, it requires two people. You can control forgiveness because you're the only player. You can't control reconciliation because it requires the other person admit their faults. Go ahead to that next slide. Can we get to reconciliation? It requires that they admit their faults and that they commit themselves to changing them. See, you can forgive, but you cannot be reconciled. That's God's story. That's the scriptural story. You're right. The cross offers forgiveness to everybody. But reconciliation is an admission of wrong. It's an acknowledgement. Paul says it this way, see, because reconciliation is also about the present. Paul in Romans, and this is, man, if you don't read your Bibles, you're just crazy because it's so darn timeless. I love what Paul says in I can't remember the text though because I don't read mine. Oh yeah, 12:18, because I'm in 1 Corinthians. Man. Paul says this, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. See, that employee, you can't control their willingness to reconcile. That spouse reconciliation, it's just not all up to you. It takes more than one player. And then there's trust. See, trust is another matter entirely. Trust is merit-based. Forgiveness is grace-based. Forgiveness is about the past. Trust is about the future. Trust is earned. It's lost the same way it's earned. Trust involves time. And I don't know about you, but I know that where I struggle with the necessary endings thing is I confuse forgiveness in particular with trust. See, the suggestion of Scripture, the suggestion of sound psychology is you can forgive somebody and still not trust them. And you can forgive somebody and have very healthy reasons for not trusting them. Because trust is earned. And I think where we get ourselves in trouble is we wish for reasons to trust somebody. And what some of the research I read differentiated was the difference between hoping and wishing. Hoping is logical. There's reasons for hoping that someone's going to change. There's reasons to think that they're going to turn it around. There's reasons to think they won't do it again. It's not wishing. Wishing is you had this idea and you're believing in your head that they're going to do something, but there's no evidence for it. We don't wish that the cross happened. We hope that it happened because there's some evidence to back it up. You don't wish that the employee is going to change or that your spouse is going to change. You hope. And when you hope, you see little fragments of evidence that give you reason for the fact that that's logical and sound. Dr. Cloud goes through a handful of things that would be evidence that it's okay to hope and thus believe that you can trust them again versus wish. The first one is simply this, that the other party, that there's a verifiable involvement in a change process. meaning they're bringing new tools into their life. They're not just saying, I'm going to do it differently. They're saying, I'm going to do it differently, and here's the person that I'm seeing. Here's the coach that I've hired. Here's the alarm clock that I purchased, whatever that might need to be. There's verifiable. You can think of it this way. If you've been trying to lose 20 pounds for 5 years, you're not going to get it done without something new entering the equation, unless you fight entropy and introduce a new idea into the equation. Second, and these are very closely related, that there's additional structure. Third, that there's an admission of need. Fourth, that there's the presence of support. You see, all of these things, what they affirm is, and here's the classic one. Oh, my husband and I are back together. Oh, really? You're back together? That's great. Why are you back together? Oh, because he's going to change. And the question becomes, so what logical reason do you have to believe that he's going to change? And if there's not a new part to the formula, then there's wishing, not hoping. Number 5, go ahead, that there's skilled help involved. And number 6, that there's some level of success. Now, I don't know if for you this creates this aha, but for me, this has been so helpful as someone that I feel like lives torn, like, okay, I want to be a Christ follower. I want to extend God's grace. I understand that I can't possibly receive it if I don't give it to others. And God goes, yeah, you're right. Forgive. Forgive people. Don't hold it against them. You benefit from that. The only way they benefit is if they acknowledge it and commit themselves to change. And all the while, be smart. It's the George Bushism, right? Like, forgive me once, shame on you. Forgive me twice, shame on you. But it was actually supposed to be shame on me. So let me ask you, where are you at with that employee, with that spouse, with that friend in that situation? And can you begin to differentiate what it means to forgive versus what it means to be reconciled versus what it means to reasonably trust? And if you're someone that's begging for someone's forgiveness, do you understand that there's more involved than just asking for their forgiveness? Do you understand that you're going to need to get help? That you're going to need to earn their trust? That God gives all of us permission to be theme people and to watch for themes in people's lives and to make good, sound decisions with those. And as you explore God, or maybe even just simply are reminded of what the story is yourself, see, it's you're forgiven. God dealt with that. And God didn't forget it. He didn't just pass over it. The cross and the blood and the tears and the grief and the pain and the suffering, that's all evidence that God stepped right into the middle of the sin. He has forgiven you and every person who's ever walked the planet. And yet, you have to choose to reconcile. You have to choose to acknowledge, and the challenge of Scripture is to live perpetually in that sense of, oh yes, God, I'm prone to wander. I'm praying every day. God, I know I'm broken. God, I need a forgiving muscle. And the Christian life, I would suggest to you, it's of trust. It's God learning that he can trust you. So he gives you a little bit and he sees what you do with it. Faithful with little, faithful as much. Can't trust you with $10. He's not going to trust you with $100,000. Those types of things. It's trust. God learning that he can trust you, and you learning that you can trust him. This is Israel. This is what we're going to explore on Christmas Eve. The Christian life is beginning to learn that we can trust God. That the Lord is your shepherd and you have no needs. That he will lead you through all kinds of seasons of life, seasons of abundant prosperity, and seasons of unspeakable grief and suffering. More than anything else, will remind you that he is the God who walks with you. Listen, if you've been following Jesus for just a short amount of time, it's logical that you don't trust God that much. That's why he says, come, learn about me and my character. Step out in faith. That's why Paul says, stop drinking milk. Like, you begin to grow in that trust. And for those of you that maybe God seems rather distant or abstract or even just kind of two-dimensional, maybe you need to do something that forces you. Maybe you need to create a discipline that forces you to remind yourself that God is trustworthy, that he'll be there no matter the situation.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.